the government of Cuba, Diaz-Canel, did say that he is open to a dialogue with the United States, and you mentioned that too. And that actually reminded me of Nicolas Maduro reportedly writing a letter to Trump to engage in a dialogue, to re-engage the United States, and he reportedly offered Washington access to natural resources in Venezuela. And of course, that wasn't good enough, and it didn't stop Trump's attack on Venezuela's sovereignty and the kidnapping of Maduro and Celia Flores. So that made me think that, well, with Cuba, there's probably not much that may stop Washington as it does seek regime change. What do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
I think the success, if we want to call it that, of the US operation in Venezuela has really emboldened the White House. They feel like they can really quite push the envelope in terms of what's possible for their foreign policy goals here in the region. I think it's important to analyze this because if you look at documents like the National Security Strategy that was published not too long ago, it clearly points to a refocusing of attention to this hemisphere, to Latin America, to the Western Hemisphere. I think my hypothesis here is that it's a strategic retreat. I think they've realized that the fight for global hegemony cannot be won in this moment. They have a peer rival in China. China has extraordinary influence throughout the world, but also particularly in Latin America. There's only a handful of countries. Off the top of my head, I believe it's Paraguay, Colombia, and Mexico, who their number one trading partner is the United States. And practically for all the rest of the countries, it's China. And so they've decided to retreat strategically to try to rebuild their forces in order to, in a future moment, dispute global hegemony again, right? They're not going to give up on that fight. And so, they engage in these actions. They've interfered in elections, for example, in Honduras, in Argentina. They are happy to see some of the results in other places, like in Chile, where a far right actor is about to take office there. And so they're really pushing for more. And I think part of why we're seeing, these aggressive actions against Cuba is around that, right? And so around the feeling like they can get away with it. And so they're going to continue to kind of head in this direction to try to exert more and more influence here in the region. And I think part of that, and it requires a self-criticism from the region's leaders here, which is that clearly the institutions that are meant to protect peace, to protect sovereignty here in this hemisphere have totally failed. They have not been able to rise to the occasion. We obviously know about the OAS. They used to call it, I believe it's Fidel Castro himself used to call it the Ministry of Colonies, right, of the United States. So it's never really been an institution that can serve the interests of the peoples of Latin America. But we saw the creation, in this century of CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. Where is CELAC? Why haven't they been able to come out with a strong position on this when we saw the kidnapping of a sitting head of state, when we saw a campaign of extrajudicial executions, called as such by UN experts in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific? And so where's the leadership in this? And I think part of the reason why the US is emboldened is because they basically haven't faced much pushback at all. There have been statements and people have condemned them, but ultimately nothing has been done to really affect their material ability to continue to carry out these kinds of actions. And like I said, they're emboldened. So they're going to keep pushing that envelope. And, we saw it right after the kidnapping of Maduro. They talked about going after Cuba. They talked about going after Colombia. They talked about going after Nicaragua, Mexico. Who knows who's next? And that's part of why I find it so frustrating that we haven't seen that regional leadership rise to the occasion, because this is not going to end with Cuba. They're going to keep going, especially if they're successful in achieving their short-term policy goals here in this region, right? If they're able to disrupt daily life as they are doing in Cuba, why wouldn't they try it elsewhere? And specifically in the case of Mexico, for example, we know that Donald Trump regrets not bombing Mexican territory in his first term. He said as much. He wished he could have done it. There are so many people in his inner circle who want to engage in unilateral military action inside Mexican territory. That it hasn't happened is actually a credit to Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, who's made it very clear in all of these regular conversations that happen between Mexico City and Washington that that's a red line and that would upend the U.S.-Mexico relationship. So clearly, that kind of diplomatic defense is working, but it can only work for so long. Do we know what they want to do? And if they're able to get away with more and more and more throughout this region, what's to stop them from engaging in unilateral military action here in Mexico? It's hard to imagine what could actually get them to stop because we haven't been vocal enough in stopping all of their other illegal activities, the extrajudicial executions, the kidnapping of a president, and this effort to suffocate the Cuban economy and cause damage, mass suffering, collective punishment against the Cuban people.
Over the course of the past several days, I've seen several propaganda videos that are clearly targeting, I think, the US population, and they are sort of driving this idea that the United States needs to bring, quote unquote, freedom to Cuba. But the notion that the United States would bring freedom to Cuba is actually quite shocking because the United States effectively controlled Cuba for half a century before the revolution. And I mean, truth be told, it ran it as a dictatorship, right, with mass poverty, and there was no democracy, there was no freedom before the revolution. So let's assume that Washington does get its way and Cuba collapses. Let's assume that worst case scenario. What would that mean for the people of Cuba?
Well, if you go by some of this propaganda that we've been seeing, it means having US multinational companies come into the country. They seem to think that freedom means being able to buy goods from Home Depot, or as an example, right? I saw this ridiculous image where they had a map of Cuba and all of these different US multinational companies, kind of their logos all over the place. That hardly sounds like freedom to me. What do people in Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela want? They want well-being. They want to have stability. They want to have a country that is able to redistribute wealth to everybody who lives in that country. I know that that term, for example, the redistribution of wealth is controversial inside of the United States, but it's not in Latin America. These are very rich countries. We have so many resources. We have a highly educated population. That's particularly true of the Cubans. The Cubans have doctors and lawyers and analysts and specialists. In fact, so many that part of their solidarity efforts has been to actually send some of them to other countries, for example, on literacy campaigns, or doctors to serve in, underserved communities that maybe have never seen a doctor before. There's incredible talent on that. But because of the international system, there is hardly a time or a place for people to actually be able to enjoy the fruits of the richness of their countries. Because, well, you have these US multinationals, for example, coming in and extracting resources or wealth or, benefiting from a highly trained workforce and extracting all of that wealth and taking it to the United States. So freedom in their eyes would be exploitation, suffering, low wages, having to compete with heavily subsidized foodstuffs that come from the United States instead of, the local agricultural communities producing the food that people need. It would be a horrible reverse for the Cuban population if this worst case scenario happened. Cuba is one of the few countries where, for example, there's very little drug trafficking happening, if there is at all. Whereas, for example, where I live here in Mexico, organized crime groups, because of the drug trafficking racket, are incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful and create a lot of instability and insecurity for the population here, which is one of the major challenges that this government here in Mexico has to face. That's not true of Cuba. Cuba is actually one of the safest countries in the world. They have guaranteed education all the way through to university. In fact, the university actually had to shut down because of this oil blockade right now, because they're not able to meet the demand to be able to provide adequate education, right? So all of these things would likely be reversed. You want to have an idea what Cuba would look like, under the yoke of US imperialism? Take a look at Haiti. Haiti is in that situation because of regular interventions. It's not because of the Haitian people. Obviously, there's a lot of issues with the oligarchy there. But in Cuba, there is no oligarchy because that's not how their economy works. There isn't a privileged, billionaire class that decides everything on the island. No, there is a revolutionary government that obeys the population. And so, just to wrap up, to summarize, it would be the worst case scenario for Cuba would be a worst case scenario for the Cuban population. It would translate into suffering, more inequality, less opportunity, and quite likely, as we talked earlier, a mass exodus of people trying to find a way to survive and provide for their families.
Right. It's been truly shocking how little the mainstream media is reporting on this. I know you mentioned the New York Times report, but we haven't seen many reports describing the situation or actually analyzing the impact of foreign policy on Cuba. And I suppose it is because the collective punishment that's been inflicted on the Cubans over the past several decades really has been normalized to a degree. And I'm fairly certain that many people in the United States have no idea that it is because of sanctions that Cuba has become so economically underdeveloped. But to be fair, I also have to mention that it is striking that we haven't seen very strong support for Cuba from many Latin American leaders either. And so, do you think that the blockade of Cuba may serve as sort of an eye-opener for Latin America, that they may be next? And do you anticipate seeing more unity in Latin America as a result of this?
Unfortunately, we haven't seen it. I thought for a moment there that perhaps this kind of aggressive position by the White House would serve as that wake-up call that you're talking about. We haven't seen it. During George W. Bush's terms, we saw precisely that. He was such an odious figure here in Latin America that it actually served as a rallying point, as a way for people to feel, that it was necessary to find unity, to forge new bonds within the region because of what George W. Bush represented, kind of that more severe, more aggressive form of imperialism, given, for example, his invasion of Iraq and occupation there. But the same hasn't happened here. And I think a lot of it is because there's a chill down the spine of most of the leadership here. I think there really is a concern that they could be next. And instead of viewing that situation and saying, they're going to pick us off one by one, therefore we should get together, there almost seems to be an instinct to try to survive, to do what's necessary. For example, we have the case of Gustavo Petro. He is a very vocal politician. He has a lot to say, and he uses his social media account consistently and aggressively. But since his meeting with Trump, where he traveled to Washington, he's been pretty quiet around the issue of Palestine, around the issue of the bombings in his country's waters, and the issue of Cuba. And I think part of it has been a sort of an acknowledgement that if he kind of lays off the criticism, that maybe Colombia will be spared. And possibly that will work over the short term. Mexico has essentially made the same gamble, saying we cannot do anything that will affect Mexico negatively. And that is almost word for word what President Sheinbaum has said. And it's true. It's held off the United States, but only over the short term. And I've made the case that by conceding over the short term, you actually are damaging the country in the long term, because they will take advantage of these perceived weaknesses. It's like with any bully. As soon as you show them just a little bit of weakness, they're going to jump on that and take advantage of it. And that's what we're seeing happening throughout the region, which is why you've seen other political leaders. For example, I often cite the comments of Guillaume Long, the former foreign minister for Ecuador under the government of Rafael Correa, who has been stressing this, that this is the moment for us to rebuild these regional institutions, to figure out what they're lacking in order to be able to present a more united front in the face of this aggression. And I've made the case that if these organizations won't or can't be rebuilt in this moment, which is probably a hard thing to imagine given the fact that, there are Bukeles and Noboas who govern countries in this part of the world, cast soon in Chile, who are more than willing to hand over everything to the United States. Well, it's going to be very difficult to reach an agreement with that. Then figure out who your allies are and make ad hoc coalitions if you have to, right? I've heard this proposal that was floated at the Nuestra America conference that I attended in Bogota, where they said, why shouldn't the oil producing countries of this region, so I'm thinking here, Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico, who have major oil reserves, create an OPEC like organization to try to bring together that resource under the collective control of the region's leadership in order to be able to kind of wield it. Because otherwise, he's going to pick everybody off one by one. But if there is a pact there, then they could say, well, we control the oil in this part of the world, and we are more than happy to have a commercial relationship with the United States on the condition that you stop your blockade of Cuba and allow us to provide oil to them. That would be a far stronger bargaining position than what we're seeing right now, which is everybody basically trying to survive on their own.